Hi, I'm Granny, and I'm going to share a family story in this episode. It's the episode when my grandmother came down with the Spanish flu. This is a story I heard at my Aunt Lollie's house. It was the custom to meet at her house after a family funeral. We have a family cemetery that was part of my great grandfather's homestead in Arizona. And so, after a family funeral, we would all meet at her house and have a potluck. And she lived on a farm, so often after the meal, the kids would go off and we'd play in the pond, in the barn with the animals. And the adults would gather in the living room and share reminiscences. It was during one of these times, and I was probably 12, 13, 14 when I heard this story. I remember when I was sitting in her living room, there was a big fireplace, and I was sitting next to that, and then the door into the kitchen. And we loved going to Aunt Lollie's house because her house was always covered with amazing flowers. I remember her dahlias were like huge. Anyway, so it was during one of these times when they were talking about the Spanish flu. It was a deadly global pandemic, just like the one we recently experienced in 2020. And it was caused by the H1N1 influenza A virus. So, not unlike COVID. The earliest documented case of the Spanish flu was in March of 1918 in Kansas, in the United States, and there were other cases around that same time in France, Germany, United Kingdom. There were successive waves. These waves occurred throughout 1918, 1919, and 1920. Well, in 1920, my grandparents were living on a little farm in southern Arizona and it was on a Monday morning, a group of men came to their farm and said, or asked my grandfather if he would meet in town in Gleason on Wednesday where everybody was meeting because everybody in the town had come down with the influenza. And they were asking people to bring whatever food that they could share or spare and leave it in the town. And then the men were going to go out hunting and they would be gone about a week. Well, this was around January or February of 1920. My dad was born in December of 1919. Gleason was a little mining town and it had been hit hard, and the food had run out. My grandfather was well known, he was a really good shot. So if anybody was needing help on a hunt, they often invited my dad, grandpa. My dad was really a good hunter also. So people in the surrounding area were asked to meet in Gleason on Wednesday, bring whatever food they could afford to share with the town, and then the men would go on the hunt. My grandmother accompanied my grandfather into town in her wagon with their kids and to take food to share. At the time, my Uncle Earl was 9 years old, my Aunt Lolly was 8, Uncle Warren was 6, Elvin was about 18 months old, and my dad was just a couple months old. It was very common at the time to meet in Gleason on a Saturday for a potluck, and then everybody would get together and dance. I remember my dad talked about how they would use the um, floor of the wagon with a bunch of quilts and stuff, and when the kids got tired, they would just go crawl up into the wagon and sleep until it was the parents were done dancing and visiting. My grandmother was well known because she was a fun loving, cheerful, talkative person. My grandfather was a little less gregarious and he'd rather listen to people talk than to talk himself. My dad was very similar to that. Anyway, so we suspect, and my grandmother suspected, that it was that Saturday night party and dancing that she caught the Spanish flu. All right, so they went into town. My grandfather went off on the hunt, and my grandmother was taking the kids back. And then it was about that time that she realized that she was coming down with the flu. Just imagine what she must have felt like. There was nobody for her to call. You don't get a phone. You don't have a phone at that time. There wasn't any place close enough for her that she could send her kids to go get help. So she knew it was her and the kids, and they had to make this work. So she began instructing the kids on what they needed to do because they had to take care of all the animals on the farm. They had to take care of their mom, who it was very common to be delirious from the flu because of the high temperatures. And I kept thinking, today we can run to the corner and get medication. There wasn't anything. I don't know what she would have used. I know there was willow bark, but then I don't remember very many willows in that area, mostly mesquite. So she began kind of telling her kids what they needed to do while she was sick, including putting the baby to the breast because he was only a couple months old. You know, Elvin being 18 months old, he could probably manage doing something himself, but I can't imagine what my grandmother must have felt like. Anyway, so they were going to be on their own for a week. Think about what it must have been like. Today, I am within minutes of all my kids who live in Utah. Literally minutes. In the furthest case, it would probably have taken my grandparents more than a day to get there. Well, to me, it's mind-boggling how lucky we are to live in a time where everything is so much closer and we can communicate. But my grandparents, it was a whole different ballgame. If they were to go anywhere, they had to plan because once they got to wherever they got, they would have to feed and water their horse and then brush it down so it wouldn't get chilled. And there was a whole process of just taking care of the horse who got you wherever you needed to get to. Anyway, so they got home, and for 1 week, Uncle Earl, Aunt Lolly, and Uncle Warren ran that farm, milking the cows, feeding all the animals, horses, cows, chickens, pigs, and securing them from the constant threat of coyotes. And also, think about this. There were 2 babies in diapers, and this was before disposable diapers. I know from living in Arizona that food storage is a huge thing before refrigeration. So I suspect they had a cellar, which is a room dug out from the ground that they would store their root veggies like potatoes and carrots. I know that my grandmother canned a lot of stuff. My dad talked about how they would hunt in the winters so that the meat would stay good because of the cold temperatures and not rot. So in other words, you didn't hunt in the spring, summer, and fall because you would either have to jerky it or anticipate the meat to get bad. Anyway, so an interesting aspect of this story was when people earlier would migrate from the eastern United States to the western United States, and when my grandparents went to Arizona hadn't become a state yet. But they did find fruit trees there. because they talked about that all the time, and some of the fruit trees were still alive when I was growing up. Anyway, so when they migrated, I know that we harvested apples and peaches and apricots. And I know my family really appreciated people who had planted those plants. So I know my grandmother did can some of those. So I'm thinking, so potatoes were probably in her cellar, and carrots, and then canned things like the apples and apricots and peach trees. And then as a kid, we would go up into the mountains and we would collect wild grapevines and make juice and jam out of them. So I'm sure my grandmother had some of that. But still, at 8, 9 years old, what an overwhelming task to provide food for your sick mom and your siblings at such a young age. Also, when I was growing up, my dad loved tomatoes almost as much as he loved bananas. But when we were growing up, he would always plan that when the hard frost hit, he would cut the tomato vines off at the roots and hang them up in our garage to keep them, so that we would keep them probably from end of December through March. Well, when he brought those tomatoes plants in and hang them upside down, he would then, as we're eating those off the vines, he would plant seeds, tomato seeds, and have them prepared so that in March they would be set out to be planted and protected, so that by the time we used up all the vines, we would normally have maybe a month with no tomatoes before the other ones ripened. And so we had tomatoes all the time. So another thing I want you to think about is today we could turn a knob and immediately get gas or immediately get electricity to cook our food. That's not the case in my grandparents' time. They had an old cast iron cook stove where it provided heat when you'd put wood in, but where did the wood come from? They had to go and chop the wood and collect it to build a fire so that they could cook the food, so that they could provide for my grandmother while she was sick and for the other kids. So and the other thing I keep thinking about is at night, they've secured all the animals in the farm, but I've lived in Arizona and I've lived out in the middle of nowhere. And you can hear coyotes howling all night long. And if you think a coyote won't sneak onto your property and eat a chicken when he can't, if it's available, he will do that. So that's another aspect that I imagine what my uncles and aunts were doing. I would have been so scared. They took care of my grandmother, their family, the farm, and all was well when my grandpa came back. I see that as nothing less than a miracle. It is such an amazing idea that young children were able to accomplish this. But they did. They must have felt like they could do anything, knowing that they nursed their mother from being very sick, and millions worldwide died from this influenza. Think about that the next time you're faced with a challenge, because I believe you don't know how strong you are until you actually do something really hard. I hope this family story was valuable to you. Join me again when I share another family memory. Thank you.